Okay, good morning. Today we are going to talk about methods of political economy in general, in Marx, of course. So we have last time we talked about this. Okay, you must be seeing this. Political economy or radical economics of Marx, but usually political economy of Marx is better. We talked last time about the difference between the appearances and the essences, according to Marx, and he said, okay, in this quote, all science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided. So then it's really difficult actually to carry out political economic studies, because what you see, what is given empirically is not the whole truth, or even it may be the distorted manifestation of the truth, in the metaphorical sense that the reality itself may be upside down, as Marx uses. He says, for example, within the competition process, everything is upside down. So what we have to do is to make it right. So we got to start from the appearances, what is empirically given, what is given by the observations in general. And starting from the observation, we should try to reach the knowledge of the essences of things, so to speak, as Marx uses. The essence meaning the real structures that create these appearances, according to the Humean account of causality. What we call causality is nothing but the coexistence of two events, so to speak, or constant conjunctions between atomistic and discrete events. So whenever an event X occurs, then we observe usually the appearance, the emergence of event B. Whenever there's an increase in the money supply, we should expect an increase in the price level or inflation rate, whatever. Well, these days, this theory seems to be working, but there are also some other economists who would disagree with this. Anyway, this is another discussion. So according to this notion, what Hume says, the notion of causality does not imply any kind of natural necessity or any kind of metaphysics. All we have actually, is these observations. We cannot go beyond these observations. If we try to do this, this is nothing but metaphysics. It doesn't work. It's not a good way of acquiring knowledge, and it's not a good way of doing science in general. So usually, mostly the positivistic account of science is based upon this kind of Humean conception of causality. But there are other forms of causality, of course. In Aristotle, for example, there are 4 different kinds of causality, and one of these kinds is interestingly, for example, teleological causality, what he calls final causality. Teleological in the Aristotelian metaphysics, of course, means more or less the realization of potentials that this particular being has. Human beings has human potential, human beings have human potentials, developmental potentialities. So our aim, our objective as human beings must be, or is, even if we are not aware of this, it is the realization of these potentialities and development. This is called happiness or flourishing sometimes, eudaimonia, good life in general. So only by doing so can we become a human being, a full-fledged, so to speak, human being. This is another kind of causality, for example. It's very interesting notion, actually. So this is, of course, against the Humean conception, in which we can only have observations and their relations or constant conjunctions. So beyond this, we cannot say anything about the ultimate reality itself. This causality may be created by some kind of cosmological process, as in Hegelian philosophy, for example. Everything that occurs must occur by necessity, and this necessity is given by the movement or journey, whatever you call, of the spirit, which is directed to its own self-realization, achieving self-consciousness at first. It starts as a form of consciousness, which is not aware of itself, and then becomes material reality, and finally, through human thinking, mostly, the spirit achieves self-consciousness, etc. So this is a kind of a cosmological process or metaphysical process in the Humean sense, and this must has no place in science, in any science. All we have is nothing but the appearances, so to speak. But Marx rejects this kind of idea, Humean conception, and he argues that what is empirically given is wrong, or at least we should adopt this kind of reflex. What we see, what we observe may be deceptive, and it is generally deceptive. So what we have to do is to go beyond these appearances and try to understand what these appearances, what these events almost are created by. What are the real processes, real generating mechanisms that would create these kinds of observations? This is one of the most important methodological principles, according to Marx, of political economy. Of course, this kind of realism was not invented by Marx himself. Since Plato, we can have this same methodological principle. What you see is distorted or wrong picture of the ultimate reality. Plato thinks, the ultimate reality is the world of forms, whereas Marx thinks that in a very much Aristotelian way, actually, Marx thinks that the ultimate reality is this reality in which we live and the material reality. So we must understand, we must try to understand what's going on in this ultimate reality, but only if we confine ourselves within the realm of empirical observations. It's not enough to know anything about the ultimate reality or truth. Of course, this is a bold statement. What you see is usually wrong, so you should go beyond. How are we going to do this? There's a passage in Marx's Grundrisse, I don't know how to pronounce it. In this Grundrisse, there's the section of method of political economy, and he explains how we can achieve the knowledge of these real structures. And in this passage, of some 3 to 4 pages, if I remember correctly, and he uses this concrete, abstract, and concrete method, sometimes as it is called by Della Volpe, for example. It's something like this. What is empirically given is the most complex and most difficult to understand. Here we can, for example, in the recent debates within the philosophy of science, we can say that, observations are usually theory laden, the famous theory ladenness principle, and even to some extent, to a great extent, actually, they are theoretical because what we see is conditioned, if not determined, by what we think or what we want to see, so to speak, if we want to put it in a crude way. So basically, and this is another problem, is that the existence of the famous riddle of induction. Hume actually developed this idea, interestingly. So far the observations may have confirmed our hypotheses, such as all ravens are black, but this does not necessarily mean that the next raven we are going to observe will be also black. So nature is not uniform in that sense. Everything can change. Actually, everything in reality is subject to change. This is the famous principle of dialectics, maybe, right? Again, the Hegelian notion, or the notion, philosophical notion of becoming. Everything changes, everything is subject to evolution, etc. So basically, Marx says that what is empirically given is the most complex, most difficult to understand. So we should not be deceived by these appearances, because everything may be in an upside down fashion, so to speak. And we should try to go beyond, deeper and deeper, so to speak, into the reality. The reality is usually a multi-layered whole, so to speak. There are different layers. Each layer emerges from the lower one, but cannot be reduced to this lower one, and it gives rise to the upper layer, etc. So there is no, in principle, actually, to go the final layer in that sense. So you should be epistemologically cautious, so to speak, as Roy Pascal would put. But still, we have the power of thinking, power of abstraction, and Marx even says that the power of abstraction in social science replaces the power of microscope, or something like that, the tools that are used in the natural sciences. So our secret weapon, so to speak, is to make abstractions. So we should try to make abstractions and try to reach an abstract model, for example. What do I mean by this? This is interestingly quite similar to what Friedman says, right? Or economists usually say. Economists work with models. A model is a simpler representation of the reality. It's like the drawing a map, right? Danny Roderick's famous book, Economics Rules, uses a particular passage. Actually, it's a short story by the Argentinian, is he? Writer Borges. In that little story, there's the story of the map makers of a kingdom, of a distant kingdom, and in that kingdom, I'm sorry, they were able to draw a one-to-one scaled map of the country. A one-to-one scale does not do anything. right? It doesn't work. It's no useful for anything, for understanding the country, etc. So we have to increase the scale, 1 to 10, 1 to 1,000, 1 to million, I don't know. Anyway, so that we can see the whole picture. Just like this, economists usually work with models. And these models are simple representations of the reality. So they are made through abstractions. If this is so, Marx would agree with this. But if this is so, how can we distinguish between a good model and a bad model? So that's an interesting question. Usually economists use models that are based upon some kind of individualistic approach, rational choice theory, etc., etc. According to them, these are usually good models, and if they yield some fruitful, according to Friedman, predictions, and these predictions are confirmed by the empirical evidence, that's enough. But Marx wouldn't be satisfied with this kind of logic. He argues that, okay, we have the power of abstraction, which is important. So maybe I should share this particular page. Yes, from Grundrisse. This is the Marxian Engels archive, Marxists.org, and in the Grundrisse, there's this production and general distribution, etc. The method of political economy, which is very interestingly. Okay, okay, this particular sentence is very important, I would say. The concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations and unity of the diverse. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration, as a result, not as a point of departure, even though it is the point of departure in reality and hence also the point of departure for observation and conception. So the concrete, empirically given, is and may be deceptive, so it's not a good starting point. What we have to do is to draw some abstraction and read some kind of theory. So we should use simpler representations of course, the reality itself. And for example, in Marx's book, Das Kapital, capitalism is used as a kind of abstract model, so to speak. Well, this is not exactly right, but still you can see that capitalism is defined as the fact that the labor power itself becomes a commodity under capitalism. So it doesn't rule out the possibility that in some parts of the economy, the labor power may not be a kind of commodity. For example, some simple commodity production conditions may appear, within the development literature, old development literature. There was this distinction between modern sector and the traditional sector and some kind of like this, but still capitalist relations of production dominate the whole society. And so it can be called capitalism, but this is a kind of a model actually, and also in Marx, for example, Marx in Das Kapital, Marx thinks that whenever he explains the notion of surplus value, he argues that the capitalist actually pays the exact value of labor power. So exploitation does not mean actually the existence of some kind of underpayments. The capitalists may actually, they generally do sometimes, or most of the times. They pay less than what labor power is worth, basically. But Marx rules out this possibility in the first volume of Capital, and then he adds this particular case in which the labor power is also underpaid, especially when he talks about crisis, in the crisis theory, or one of the crisis theories, namely the growing industrial reserve army, etc. So basically, Marx also uses these kinds of abstractions, and this is, in a sense, similar to what Weber calls ideal types. We try to abstract some unnecessary features of the reality that we observe, so that this is the meaning of abstraction, right? So we come up with a model which is simple, of course, which cannot cover the whole aspects of the reality, empirical reality, but still, nevertheless, it is still useful to understand the reality itself. We talk about mode of production. Mode of production itself is a kind of abstraction. Capitalism, when we explain the working of capitalism, is a kind of abstraction, right? Just like in economics, vulgar economics. We have these models, the working of the market, for example, right? There's demand, there's supply, but what's going on in a specific market is much more complex than this. There are different variables that we should also consider, but for the beginning, we can reach some kind of abstract model, and this abstract model will suffice for our purposes in the beginning. Then in time, maybe if we try to understand greater parts of the reality, we can add some different features to our model so that we can understand the reality in its totality, so to speak. So Marx says that the concrete itself, what is empirically given, is the most difficult to understand. So we should try to come up with some kind of models, theories actually. And then these theories must be, again, used to explain the empirical reality. In what ways the real structures that are supposedly explained by our theory, in what sense these real structures give rise to the appearances or observations that we have. So we have a three-staged, so to speak, explanation, process of explanation. We start from the concrete, maybe, knowing that it's not enough. So in the second step, we will have an abstract model. And then in the third step, again, we should return to the concrete, but this time we are equipped with a good theory, of course. And this theory could be useful to explain or to understand the reality in its depth, so to speak. So, I'm sorry. So in this abstraction phase, the totality as it appears in the head, as a totality of thoughts, is a product of a thinking head, which appropriates the world the only way it can, a way different from the artistic, religious, practical, and mental appropriation of this word. The real subject retains its autonomous existence outside the head, etc., etc. So you should, I would recommend you to read especially this particular section in the Grundrisse, the method of political economy. So what we should do is first starting from the concrete and then go to the abstract and come up with a model or a theory, and then this theory is to be applied to the concrete reality itself, to the reality of the empirical realm, so that we can understand the reality. This is different from the positivistic understanding. In there we start from some principles, especially in the Friedmanian way, such as the principle of rationality, for example, and we try to deduce a theory which aims to uncover the real or hidden meaning within these first principles, and then this theory would produce some kind of predictions, and these predictions are to be confronted with the empirical evidence, with the observation. If observation confirms the theory passes, etc. But of course, I'm sorry, this line of logic is flawed in the Marxian thinking. Actually, it is rejected by the recent philosophy of science traditions, especially after Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn argued that it is the paradigms, or as the general outlook of scientists, or disciplinary matrix, that determines what the individual scientist would see even. So once again, what we call empirical observation is a kind of theoretical statement, etc. So Marx argues first that empirical evidence, empirical observation is not enough, sense experience is not enough. Second, we should use the power of abstraction in order to go beyond these appearances. Of course, this is a process of thinking, process of abstraction, the result of which is the theory, and this theory in return would be applicable, would be applied to the empirical observation, so that we can explain what's going on, what's really going on in the capitalist reality. This is the method that Marx uses in his book, Das Kapital. So this is an important methodological principle, I would say. Okay, returning to our thing. Okay, the second point is the notion of becoming. Actually, everything changes. Well, everything changes, everything. For example, again, in Das Kapital, Marx argues that we should distinguish between the human nature, the notion of human nature, or that is eternal, so to speak, as long as human beings exist, and what is general, actually. We should distinguish between what is general and what is particular in human nature, the notion of human nature. What do I mean by this? For example, Marx criticizes Bentham in that particular footnote, and he says that Bentham's human being, Bentham's subject, is nothing but the British petit bourgeois. Sometimes it is translated as British shopkeeper. The idea is that our Homo economicus. Homo economicus, we believe, or economists usually do believe, that is not a historical category that exists only in a particular phase in human history, but it's a general feature of humanity. Even some 10,000 years ago, human beings were also rational, and they try to maximize their utilities, etc., etc. But Marx argues that this kind of behavior is a result of capitalism, or the market system. Market mentality is to be brought about by the development of capitalism, beginning from the 13th, 14th, whatever century. So we should be careful about distinguishing between what is general and what is specific, what is particular in human beings. We are all human beings, as Aristotle says. We are all rational beings, right? Rationality in the sense that we have to obey the deliverances of reason. so to speak. We should use our reasoning in order to know anything, including ourselves. And John Locke even once said, God created man as a two-legged animal and left the job of making him rational to Aristotle, something like this. But rationality is also important in economics, but this is a different type of rationality. Of course, it's related to the first sense of rationality, but it's a much more limited conception of rationality in which we only care about our choices and the results of these choices. We should try the best option and on the basis of the costs and benefits comparison, etc. So basically, this kind of behavior, according to Marx, is a result of the 19th century civilization or capitalism in general. And he also criticizes Adam Smith and Ricardo in the same way. And he argues that these political economists actually confuses the 19th century way of behavior, so to speak, with the general human historical behavior. For Marx, actually, both Smith and Ricardo are the founders and the most important economists of the political economy tradition. Not necessarily founders, but they represent some kind of peak of the political economy tradition in his time. So he has a great admiration and respect for these two guys, but he also believes that their accounts are not historical in the sense that they assume the existence of Benthamite, so to speak, behavior as a general feature of humanity in general. So what is historical and what is general are two different things. And this means that to some degree, human nature could be more plastic in the sense that it can be malleable, so to speak, by the circumstances. You know, we as human beings, we have some part of constant features, as in the rationality principles, for example, and also in the Aristotelian thinking, we have these human potentialities. So our aim is to realize, no matter what the conditions, material conditions are material conditions in which we live, basically. So it's very important to distinguish between what is general and what is particular or what is specific in human history, and some categories belongs to the whole of human history, but some categories, such as labor power being commodity, for example, belong only to specific modes of production. So we should be careful about this. In that sense, to some degree, at least, it is not clear actually much to what degree exactly, but to some degree, human beings are changing. Not only human beings, but the material conditions in which they live or the modes of production change, and history is subject to constant change and even ruptures and revolutions. You know, the transition from one mode of production to another will be created by some kind of social revolution in Marxian historical materialism thinking. And this is important. And recently, this idea of evolution was used extensively by the economic tradition that is called evolutionary economics, you know, even starting with Adam Smith, but I'm sorry, mostly Schumpeter, that creative destruction process is one of the most important methodological principles behind this evolutionary economics. The principle is simple. The principle that nature does not make leaps is wrong. On the contrary, nature makes leaps. So this is the most important idea of the evolutionary economics. Economies do change and they evolve, human beings evolve, etc., etc. So when you see Marx's whole work, you can see that, especially in history and also in capitalist reality, Marx always considers the importance of change and evolution, both in human history and even in capitalism. For example, he discusses the importance of technological improvements in Das Kapital, and he constantly emphasizes this process of change in technology and its results. And also this process, the change of technology, is to be seen by Marx as a kind of interplay between human beings and also technological improvements, or sometimes the technological improvements are tried to be controlled by the capitalists, etc., etc. This is a very interesting discussion. Das Kapital, chapter 15, I'm not sure. Anyway, so basically the notion of change and evolution, etc., is important in understanding Marx's work. For now, it's enough actually to talk about this feature, but in due course, we will be having enough opportunity to discuss this feature of reality. Okay, so another aspect, important aspect, is the relationship between individual and society. And maybe at this point we can stop and have a break.